The third Philosophy Portal anthology, Logic for the Global Brain, is now available. To pick up a copy, visit philosophyportal.online.
Don't say that. Okay.
Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with a friend of the channel as well as a long-term contributor to Philosophy Portal, Dimitri Crooijmans. For those of you who don't know Dimitri's been engaged with Philosophy Portal for the last 2.5 years and has published several articles, including contributions to Enter the Alien, as well as Abyssal Arrows. And today we're here to talk about his two contributions to the newly released anthology, Logic for the Global Brain, paper on true infinity, and a paper titled The Work of Love. And of course, these two concepts, true infinity and love, are intimately related, and they're situated right next to each other in the anthology. And so in this conversation, we're just going to unpack a little bit about what Dimitri was going for with these two dimensions of his paper. I will say quickly, check out Dimitri's writings also on Actual Spirit Substack, and I'll leave a link to that in the description. And I guess diving right into true infinity itself. At the start of the paper on true infinity, Dimitri, you say that true infinity is what Hegel refers to as the fundamental concept of philosophy. So maybe first for the viewers, go into a little bit about what the heck does true infinity mean, and by juxtaposition, what would a false or a bad infinity mean?
Yeah, so just on the importance of the term, he doesn't call it one of the fundamental concepts of philosophy. In the encyclopedia, he says it's the fundamental concept of it, and fundamentals about a fundament, which is about a grounding. What inspired me to write this paper was not only when he said this, but also in the science of logic, when he goes into true infinity, when he says this is the first time that we encounter the absolute in a, let's call it like a logical concept. So to summarize this term, which you can complexify a lot, like if you will read my paper or Hegel himself, you will see that there's lots of intricate, delicate distinctions and logical movements you can explicate. But to summarize it to something that's that we can take, that we can bear, I would say that true infinity is the logic of infinity and finitude. That's where I would start. And what is this? Well, commonly, infinity is to be held to be the negation of finitude, or in German it's unendlich, so it's unending, it's limitless, it's boundless. That's what infinity is. Finitude is of course endlich. It's that which comes to an end. It's limited. And the thing is that the moment you make this distinction, you limit what you just called infinity by the finite. Because what is infinity? Well, it is that which is not finite. So first of all, its concept doesn't come from itself, but it has to oppose itself to finitude. And by opposing itself, it's already finite too. So it turns out that opposing infinity to finitude, you get two finites, two different types of finites, one self-disavowed finite, you could say. And therefore, I would say that true infinity is the unity of infinity and finitude. Now, there's also other ways we can go about this, but this is the core of, in its simplicity.
In its general sense, I feel like this is kind of a nice introduction to the way Hegel thinks in general, in the sense that, like you're saying, this is the fundamental concept for him and a sort of grounding move. But this way in which Hegel will always view things that people usually hold as separate or apart in some sort of strange higher order unity seems to be a feature of his thinking in general, seems to be a feature of the logic in general. I mean, the first thing I want to ask in regards to the dialectic of finitude and infinity is the way in which this has practical application to the way we normally think about God. the way we normally think about heaven. Even
Mm.
in the New Age tradition, the way people in the New Age tradition will talk about infinite or boundless or limitless consciousness. But the way in which these topics are usually addressed is without a dialectic that involves the subject. And I think in your paper, you go into this, the dialectic of finitude and infinity. So, how has this sort of changed or impacted your own views about God, heaven, consciousness, and so forth?
Yeah, so if I say God is infinite, but I grasp it in a way that I oppose his infinity to the finite and see God as being some transcendent entity in the heavens, probably, which I also think then would be infinite, this God actually turns out to be finite. But if we take God to be truly infinite, then he cannot be reduced to this finite infinity. And spirit for Hegel is a mode of God, and spirit for Hegel is truly infinite. So what does this mean? Well, spirit is the unity of infinity and finitude, and you could, yeah, there's so many different ways you could go about this. You could say that spirit in its movement is principally infinite, but each instantiation of its infinity is finitized. It's like, um, or you could also go about it in another way, like when I'm working on an art project, there's some infinite notion I seem to have in my mind, which is potential, right? It's infinite in the sense that it could go anywhere. But the moment I try to write down a poem or the lyrics or philosophical work or even in painting, I am delimiting and limiting that potentiality. So I'm thereby like finitizing infinity. But this very act of finitizing infinity is is a feature of true infinity. Is a feature of true infinity. So the trick is like if if I if I do this and go through this process and have some kind of product that I create and can objectify, when someone else uh, will intuit it or like perceive it or like conceptualize this, an infinity can shine forth. I would say a certain logic can shine forth from that, or can be thought through from that creation, that can be taken up by them and can be made into their own finitization. So what does this mean? Yesterday I just published an article on the free will. Only the free will is thoughtful. So I could present Hegel's structure of free will, which I'm inspired by a lot. But what I tried to do in this article is that I did not try to conclude the article in a way that the thinking process is finalized. But what I try to do, and I hope I succeeded at this, is that I open up new kinds of thinking for other subjects. And I think this is a feature of true infinity that is not only of a philosophical nature, but in a very concrete, practical nature in your daily life. So I think if we take Shakespeare, Shakespeare is one man, and therefore he's finite, and he has a certain style which is also finite, but the breadth and the depth of his works, of his complete works, seem to be truly infinite. When we read a Shakespeare or any great figure that we're inspired by, we seem to constantly get new insights. But these insights are still, however, contained by a singularity. But these insights themselves are universal. Like take Hamlet, for example. How many times has Hamlet like been used? So many people find a universality in that, and thereby it seems to me to be getting at a concrete universality, not some abstract thought that he just imposes in his own particular way. But no, he he brings something forth. He finitizes his potentiality. He chose to make the artwork. He doesn't only have it in his head, which is a way that we sometimes do want to like retain our infinity. Because who can critique me when I have my own great idea and I don't finitize it, right? Then it stays infinite, but it's opposed to reality. It's opposed to reality. So by realizing it, I finitize it, but in this process itself, true infinity emerges.
I think the whole struggle and the whole genius of getting into this form of philosophy is that you're constantly struggling with thinking about how eternity or infinity, all of these high level metaphysical concepts are actually actual and concrete in the historical process itself. And this is, it might
Yeah.
seem simple just if you understood that sentence, but it really involves a lifelong wrestling. Like it really is concretely actual with your partner, with your mother, with your brother, with your deepest hobbies, like you were describing with the artistic process or reading
Yeah.
Shakespeare. Like it has so many actual consequences. It has actual consequences when you're like, and like you just did, analyzing literature or analyzing science, or, when I started to get into Hegel, I started thinking about figures like Newton in a totally different way. I started thinking about figures like Darwin in a totally different way because you're thinking about them as true infinities participating in a historical process. And I just wanted to ask in regards to this, maybe we need to go deeper into the distinction between the spurious or the bad infinity and the true infinity. And the proposition I want to throw out to you to see what you think about it is, would you say it's fair to say that spurious infinity is caught up in this endless self-relation to some impossible transcendent reality in the beyond, and true infinity is almost like a traumatic opening to the actual other right here and now? Is that
Mm.
is that is that a fair distinction? How do you make sense of that distinction?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very fascinating distinction actually to make, because this is well, yeah, I let me just say this first. So I wrote this paper, I think 10 months ago. So I'm not a philosopher of the letter, right? I don't remember exactly how Hegel sentence structure was, and I cannot replicate it to you right now. But that what philosophy is about? No, that's not philosophy, I would say. It's that's the difference between, learning philosophy and learning to philosophize. So there's a difference there. And what you said with this one sentence that if I say one sentence like true infinity exists, then it's the unity of infinity and finitude. Or I could also say spirit is that which knows spirit. It's true, but it's abstract. So the truth of these notions are not actually in these notions. Well, they are in these notions themselves, but they are also in the further extrapolation, explication of these notions, the differentiation of these notions into, I would say also like, it's got almost like a branching like structure to it, in a way. So, for example, like take the philosophy of right. Philosophy of right only functions because of free will. Hegel says right necessarily presupposes the concept of free will. And but it's only there in right that we find the truth of free will, in how free will is objectified and how it actually exists. So to your question about a certain type of openness we find in true infinity for the other, which is like it seems to be a sign of traumatic core. And here I want to make a distinction between what Hegel calls reflexivity and then the in and for itself, which is different. So you could see Hegel's three moments as like an abstraction, a negation, and a concretion, which is a return back to this abstraction, but in a renewed way. But I think that the second moment, the negativity, that's still where reflexivity is at. So that return is a reflection. It's a return. That's literally what reflex means in Latin. But this return is actually beyond my own reflection because it takes in the objectivity of the world into itself. And so this is, I think, the distinction for Hegel between something like a Kantian morality, which is reflexive, and also something like a Fichte, and then the some kind of objectivity of itself of ethical life. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds of the distinctions between these philosophers, but I think that yes, taking up the impossibility of the encounter of the other does allow for opening up the process of true infinity, or like the awareness of the process of true infinity. And this is what, yeah, this is the break, what like kind of what love is. And this, the truth of that traumatic encounter, like, you know, seeing that girl for the first time, or falling in love, or even like in the Abrahamic traditions, like God being on the mountain and giving the tablets, you know, giving the law, that's also a traumatic, that was a traumatic encounter, traumatic alien encounter. um there wasn't a transaction. It wasn't like, oh, we're just gonna do what he says and then we'll get this, because otherwise you wouldn't get the book of Job in the Old Testament. So anyhow, to be open to this traumatic encounter and taking this traumatic encounter up within yourself, I think this is a true infinity, and this is a, yeah, a relational process. This is the I with the other, the I as an other, and also sometimes it's the other that's more the I than you yourself are. You know, it's like when we are talking with our friends or our loved ones, and they say something, you're like, fuck, I didn't even know that I thought that, but you are saying it better than me. You know, so being able to recognize yourself in this way, I mean, this also shows that you yourself are a true infinity to yourself.
I think that in what I perceive to be and have perceived to be when I was working in the university, this emphasis on the ontology of relations and this emphasis on the ontology of processes. I guess I could boil down my discomfort and my disappointment with these ontologies in the dimension that it seemed like they were actively excluding the traumatic core of the relation, and like excluding the fact that the relation that we find in true infinity is this encounter with something alien, something disturbing, and that to reflect and to take this within yourself, I think is, I don't know if you would agree, but I think this is where we perhaps do get into the weeds of the distinction between a Hegel and a Kant. So just to like refer back to the cover image here of the Logic for the Global Brain, we have Hegel kind of looking into the abyssal, let's say the abyssal other, and he's naked in the water. So he's like really swimming in the thing. And then we have Kant on the back who's staring. He is reflecting. He is reflecting, but he's reflecting his own image. And he's scared to get into the thing. And so like it's the difference between like this narcissistic almost capture in the image versus the, say, the traumatic encounter with the other. And well, I like that our friend Jason brought that out, but it seems like a lot is at stake there in the capacity to reflect on one's essence, but also to mediate that into a concrete encounter or a concrete manifestation. I was just thinking that this perhaps reflects the distinctions between being as perhaps abstract, if we're going to say like abstract, negation, concrete, that being would be more on the level of the abstract, negation would be more on the level of essence, and the concrete might be on the level of the concept. I'm not sure if you've thought about that yourself, or what the consequences of all of these things are for radical forms of differentiation that I think open up with the logic.
Yeah, I think there's to talk about the what you call the relation type philosophies. I think it's of course open. It's important that we are open as people, open to the other, open to relationships. But openness itself, we cannot really directly get at it. Either because it becomes destructive, or because it actually is a self-disavowed otherness that's the most type of close that you could ever imagine. Like take relativism. Relativists think of themselves as being very open, taking everything into account. Everything is relative, everything has its merit or not. But actually, because it does have its own standard it upholds, which is the relative standard, everything is in relation to that standard and reduced to that standard. So it's not a real openness. It's not a real openness. To have a real type of openness, you cannot go off abstract description and then apply this to others. What you have to do is you have to follow through with your own logic and come to a moment of conclusion, which is decisive and it's determinative, and therefore it's a closure. In German and Dutch, it's Entschluss, or like Beschluss is like to enclose, to close. But it's only through this closure that you open up something new. And this is to be resolute. If you want to resolve your notions and not only reconcile with yourself, but reconcile the concept, then you must be resolute with the concept. And yes, these two words do have the same etymological root. So there is something there which is super contradictory, right? Because how can I be resolute while at the same time be resolving with the other that I don't want to reduce the other to my own resolute determination of what I think reality is. So I think this is where the work of love actually comes in, because the work of love is the name of something is the name of the work to work with this process. How do we do this? Well, that's all this is what I try to explicate in the paper itself. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's good to note the connection between these two papers. So true infinity here being the dialectic of finitude and infinity. And it might seem abstract at first, but it actually does have super concrete applications to the way we live our lives. And it also has a way of, I think, defending ourselves against a certain spontaneous reflexive ideology with the way in which finitude and infinity typically appear in our language and typically are expressed in our metaphysics. But then what to do with this and how to live with this. And like you say, pointing towards the work of love seems to be where this comes out in your work. But before getting into, let's say, the nitty-gritty of the way you're thinking about the work of love, you end the paper of True Infinity by talking about our lives really as a joke, as a comedy. And that, almost like the importance of this movement from tragedy to comedy. And how do you think that relates to the distinction between, let's say, the bad infinity and the true infinity? Because I would also presuppose, and throw this to you, is that to really embody the nature of true infinity would be the only way to move from tragedy to comedy. That if you're stuck in the domain of the separation between finitude and infinity, I think we'd only be able to perceive our lives as tragic.
Yeah. Well, that's the claim I made, but then I read a great book that kind of traumatized me, because I realized that I was wrong, or at least too one-sided with this. And it's a classic book in the history of Dutch literature from 1967. It's called Turkish Fruit. It's very short and it's super comedic. I can highly recommend it. You can read it in like 2 hours. But so the structure of this book is as follows. There's a guy and he finds the perfect woman. So he finds the perfect woman. It turns out that actually she's receptive. So he is overly ecstatic. Well, what happens is that because her bitch of a mom, she's not allowed to date him. So he tries to go to her place. They have sex. Her mom comes in. He just keeps fucking her until she comes. And then all kinds of weird things. This book is super explicit. That's why I love it. But anyway, what happens is like this relationship doesn't work out. So then what else can he do but still try to find the perfect woman? So he starts dating. He starts fucking like so many different types of women, and they're all different, and they have different bodies, and but they are not the perfect woman. They're not the perfect woman. Every time he's having sex with any of them, he's just reminding himself or like imposing his fantasy of his lost relationship on this woman who he's just using. And these women are hence in a series of a bad infinity, because he's not developing any deep connection with any of these women. He tried, but it didn't work out. So eventually what happens is that this other woman becomes very sick, and she, she becomes ugly. She gets she becomes bald, and like everything is saggy and stuff like this. But when he saw her, he still saw her in her peak years. So what happens is that this woman is basically, everyone leaves her behind. She also tried some relationships, it also didn't work out. Then she becomes demented, uh, old and kind of ugly and very confused in this hospital bed. And the only one who visits her is him at the very end of the book. So the structure of the book is very interesting, because you get this explosion of love, which works out for a bit. Then it breaks. Then you get the series of bad infinity, and all the time he's fantasizing about getting back to her and also trying obscene things to get back to her, which is super comedic and super ridiculous, and it's really a joy and a delight to read. But then at the very end, you realize that this super ridiculous, overly tragic comedy finds this like deep truth in the craziness of his fixation. Because to conclude, like, when you start reading this book, both of them are addicted to sex. He's way more addicted to sex than her. So it looks just, he says, yeah, I love you and all these things, but when you are reading it, it just looks like he's just saying all these types of things just because he loves her body, not her soul or her spirit. But then at the end, very end of the book, he actually sacrifices anything that he has, not to maintain this fantasy of her, but because there, in that, strangely, in that comedic perversion, there's a deeper kind of tragedy, which is truly loving. So that's how I would. That's why I thought this book was a good example of how it's not only the move from tragedy to comedy, but also from comedy or comedic tragedy to some kind of tragedy, which is, it's, you can relate this to the different types of like pathologies, like neurosis, perversion. Like, these have different ways to go about these types of relational dynamics. Anyway, why do I don't disavow the truth of moving from tragedy to comedy? It's because I don't think that we are to hold ourselves up that things are merely finite. Because saying something is finite delimits it. But prior to going through the conceptual experience of it, you cannot really say whether it's delimited or not. You have to go through the process so that at the end of it, you can say whether it is delimited or not. So Heidegger, for example, says, yeah, we are beings towards death. Well, death is our delimiter, so we are finite. But I think that's cheating. And I think a good example of this would be is how what comedy does, or the comic nature of reality does, is that it shows us that the reality doesn't turn out to be the way that we thought it was. Like when I'm talking and I make a joke, because you thought I was going to talk about some serious reality, and you find out that maybe I wasn't, or maybe I just turn out to be contradictory to myself. We laugh. It's ridiculous. It's funny to us. There's the subjective split. So that's where we can see a true infinity inside of what we think is finite, which is reality itself, because reality is, being towards death in that Heideggerian sense. So this is what I mean. I think that this connects to my other work on the I, and also on what I wrote in the Abyssal Arrows, the anthology, is that split subjectivity, creativity, innocence, comedy, and true infinity are deeply, deeply related. And when we can not be so fixated on our determinations which we deem finite, but we can move with the notion where the true infinity will emerge itself, whether it's in a joke or it's in a great explication of a philosophical idea. That's where we can see this, and that's, yeah, I think that's to me. I'm currently writing a short story uh, called with a friend, and it's called Enlightenment, but it's not enlightenment in the sense of just having this complete full knowledge, but it's about an enlightening, and it's about a de-armoring and an opening up of the concept. And I think this is what comedy also does. You know, you get a catharsis, and then when you make a few jokes with someone you just met, then you feel more comfortable because there's not such an stark opposition. You know, you can just free flow with a nice conversation. Yeah.
I think the example of, say, serial dating or just having sexual intercourse with many different people is perhaps and especially if that serial dating, especially if that sexual intercourse with many different people is purely based on, say, imagistic attraction, immediate imagistic attraction. I don't think there's any better concrete example of the spurious infinity. And then when you
Yeah.
gave the example of the older woman with a saggy body, old body, wrinkly
Mm.
body, aging body, but that you still see the transcendent beauty in such a figure, there's probably no better example of true infinity, or possibly
Yeah.
also here connecting to the idea of the work of love. In fact, it's something you mention in your paper about reason's capacity to think with true infinity. You say that reason's capacity to think with true infinity involves the loss of the beyond of the bad infinity and not yet another positive representation or picture thought of some great external vastness. So here, if you want to just connect that to some practicals, like when someone is serial dating, when someone is just jumping from one beautiful body to another beautiful body, I think they are being driven by obviously picture thought. They're being driven by positive representation. And I think underlying all of that is this idea of some great external vastness that they're going to conquer, or that they're going to, you know, sublate, bring into their own being. And I was thinking here about Todd McGowan's notion of moving from lost to lack. That I think that moving from lost to lack might also be an interesting way of thinking about the story you were just describing, but
Yeah.
also thinking about what does it really take to enter into the work of love.
Yeah. I think something another way to think about this is that for the understanding, let's say maybe for the understanding that says, well, reality is finite, everything is finite, it actually takes the finite to be infinite. So there's also a problem there, because it's beholden to this infinite finitude, and it's so that's a very heavy kind of mode of subjectivity to be in, actually. And I think serial dating is also a very heavy mode of subjectivity to be in. Why? Because why is that the case? Because if you will do like serial dating or having sex for the sake of sex and adding another number to the list, I think this is a transactional mode to go about it, right? This is a transactional mode, and there's always another one. The list is never ended, but the list is ended or collapsed into itself, or and discarded when you can find that when you can find an infinity in a finite itself, in a finite itself. So yeah, I think this is also where the notion of enlightenment comes in, that to raise ourselves to an awareness of the concept of true infinity, not only in this logical way that I just talked about, but to really differentiate it in your own life, that type of logic in your own way is an enlightening. It's like it's not a being stuck with a heaviness that sees this beyond, that it wants to get to and is beholden to and is opposed to it, and is a burden that is carried upon us. So I think, yeah, it's a move from fixation, which is imagistic, and Hegel can help you to see how the logic of the image actually works, because the logic is in a like the image is in a logic, but you have to not be, let's say, conceptually fixated to be aware of that. And that's also, like, I think if we do that, we also are moving towards true infinity, and we're taking note of how true infinity is actual.
You actually, one of my favorite parts of your paper on true infinity is the way you describe the way in which reality and fiction are intertwined. And
Yeah,
you do that
yeah.
towards the end of the paper, but the way you approach that, I think, is quite profound. So, you know, let's say when we usually think about reality, you say we usually think about degenerative reality, our bodies are going to go to nothing, or the universe is going to go to nothing. But you sort of state that itself is a type of obscurantist fiction,
Yeah,
let's say, like,
exactly. And
and
that's a
then
heavy one. That's, yeah, that's what
it's a
I
very
was gonna
heavy
say.
one. And I think that a lot, it's a tremendously heavy one. But then on the other side, you talk about the real in the image, which is pointing towards some absolute truth, but at the same time, there's a twist because the real in the image is an absolute truth that has to be transcended in a way. And perhaps this is what we call traversing the fantasy, or perhaps this is what we call becoming less fixated on a specific image. There can be perhaps more dynamism, more mobility in the image. And you also, I think, say an important thing is that the real in the image that's pointing towards an absolute truth can also be used as something that guards against freedom and that can be used to as a certain attitude, as a certain style that refuses to fall into love. And I'd just be interested to know, how do you think this has appeared in your life, or how do you think this has appeared in people you see in society at large, where people are actually defensively guarding themselves, refusing to fall in love? Because I think this is a major feature of
Mm,
society.
wow, yeah. But yeah, that's a huge question. I didn't expect that one. Let me well, falling in love is just, it's so dangerous. And when I'm saying falling in love, I am not only referring to falling in love with the opposite sex or romantic partner, or like the desire for this and something like this, and the disappointment which will be inevitable. Even if you stay with that partner, the disappointment will come. You will have to shed your skin. You will have to get out of yourself to to be able to come back to yourself and reconcile with the fact that it is not all that. It is not all that. But still, it is, because that's also not the end of it, right? It's not the end of it that there is just a disappointment here. So yeah, I falling in love. I I think so. I would like to use a metaphor here of the body, and I would say between the genitals and the mind. So these are opposed, right? We can oftentimes see that the understanding or the mind represses, like pretends it doesn't exist, and then this like genital reality, the sexual realm, becomes very unthoughtful, becomes pathological, or just plainly insecure, filled with shame, filled with like feelings of guilt that it cannot even bear to, like, puncture the in between, so that it will have to think that reality, and also that think that, like, the mind is influenced. There's an interconnection between the mind and the genitals, and the genitals and the mind, and what's between them? Well, that's the heart. So I think falling in love is not only, it's it's not about the genitals or the mind. It's about the unity of them in the heart, which is a contradictory unity. But I think if we think about falling in love in this way, I'm not only talking about falling in love with with someone of the opposed sex or the same sex, but also the overwhelming feeling of love that we experience when we encounter beauty, like a great work of art. This is kind of a love we have for the work of art, and for the the artist. And philosophy is very tricky here because philosophy unites form and content in such a way that it becomes very intimate, I would say. Like, for example, if I make a painting, then I can just have my own personality, make the painting, and then people don't even have to know who I am. With philosophy, it's not like this. You cannot have impersonal philosophy because philosophy is only true insofar as it becomes personalized, and this personalization is taken back up into universality. So philosophy as, the love of wisdom, or as I would say, the love of knowing and knowing itself, this is yeah, like we can have a philosophical receptivity latent that is too repressed to actually to be able to enter for people. Like, for example, just a very concrete example, when I'm meeting someone new and someone knows I'm doing philosophy, or they ask me what I'm doing and I say this, I never try to go into philosophy. When I notice a receptivity and an openness, and we're already having a nice friendly conversation, I don't have a problem with this. But a lot of people who are not into it think that I just have some kind of concept castle and that I'm going to impose it on them, or that this is philosophy, or it feels that way maybe for them, because they're like, oh well, you read a lot and you did a lot and I don't know this, so you're just coming with your own thing onto me, and that I don't like that. And they are right to not like that, because who am I to tell them how things work? So that's why I'm saying, like, philosophy and love are so intimately connected. Like, Plato makes the same point in this symposium. It necessarily involves a process of transference, and transference is that radical decision, which is it's like, I'm closing myself off to open myself up to this. And once you do this to a certain philosopher, which is inevitably going to be the case if you want to do philosophy, then you're gonna have to fall in love with the person as well. I do think, yeah, we have to be as radical as this, and saying that if you love a philosophy, well, you love the philosopher itself. And what I just said before, that the philosopher is a person, and so he's a contained he's a contained finitude. He's one particular man. But in the corpus, or the explication of the notion, the work of his drive, there we can find the true infinity of his singularity that is universal. So it can go either ways. You can, I think, some kind of concept can catch your attention, but it's also that the way that person personalize the way the person has personalized the universality of their concept, this can also be attractive. So this can also be charismatic, and this can also makes you fall for a philosopher. So yeah, but this is this is radical and a very dangerous type of things.
It's
Falling in love.
super important, and I think we need to go into the distinction here because I think there's so much practical consequences, specifically for the dimension of, let's say, the problem of the concept castle, and the problem of someone bringing their set of concepts and either actually or the other person feeling like those concepts are being imposed on the situation, which is kind of imposing a transcendental schema. And imposing a transcendental schema, whether consciously or unconsciously. And when it comes to the presupposition that philosophy is intimate, involving transference, I think the question arises that when one wants to start engaging philosophy with the other, the question is where to start or how to start.
Mm.
And what I would propose to you, and maybe this is something that you've already experimented with, or just sort of get your feedback to where you are with this, is that I think we need to start from speculations derived from either lived experience or, perhaps more importantly, wherever the real cracks of the present moment are. So in other words,
Mm.
not starting with like have you read Hegel, or have you read Schelling, or have you read Kant, or have you read Nietzsche? But rather just simply like, what are the cracks of the present moment? And if certain concepts inspired from philosophy are relevant to those cracks, then they could be used in a way that doesn't seem imposing or doesn't seem overwhelming. But if it's basically, do you start with the crack and do you radicalize the crack, or do you start with the castle and impose the castle on all cracks? That's kind of how I'm thinking about it. Does that resonate with the way you think about it?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I and this is what I'm trying to say with philosophy, that philosophy has its own form for its content. So I don't come with my own formalism and then apply it to some content, some situation or some question. But this very form of philosophizing itself, to tarry with the crack and to investigate the crack and to get an insight into the crack and to be able to sublate opposition and to be able to yeah to make yeah to sublate self-opposition in yourself and in others by the immanent concept itself. Like, this is actually true transcendence. That's the I think that's the maybe the mystery the mystery of it. Like, that it's not that transcendence and immanence are just an opposition that are there and we have to choose that one or the other one. No, it's because of that, because of being with that crack and being able to stay there and to be able to stay aware of it and also to decide to think about it. Yeah, this is where I think true philosophy comes about. So it's not, and this is like, that's for me, as you know, I consider myself a philosopher. Like, when I'm going out into the world, like, there's many philosophical things you can just learn from so-called non-philosophical cases or like persons or whatever. So yeah, I think that's where true philosophy is at.
Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month, we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept. What's coming to my mind is looking for another segue into the work of love, but what is the connection, or how do you process the work of love with what I would call unsublatable opposition? Because I think that, you know what I mean? Like there are many times where you confront opposition which is in principle sublatable, meaning in principle something that one could raise above the opposition and to find a new unity from which to think, from which to work, from which to love, from which to live. And then there are moments, at least I've experienced many moments, where you seem to confront unsublatable opposition either as such or given the context of the relation and the way it is at that moment. How do you think about like this tension? I guess where it's, I would employ the quote that you use in the work of love, that in love we find the most immense contradiction. So by definition, we're going to experience contradictions, which at least in the moment we feel, how can I deal with this unsublatable opposition?
Yeah, yeah. This is the thing, because the words like freedom and love and openness, they sound very nice. Of course we want to be free, of course we want to be loving, of course we want to be open, but there, it's not as simple as that, because these contradictions contain their own opposite within themselves. That makes also their notion so great, I think. Take freedom. French Revolution was about freedom. It ended up in terror. You know, the Communist Revolution was about freedom. Nobody said it was about terror, but it turned into terror. Just like love, you know, like you can hate authentically, deeply, like from love, because of love. I would hate if you know my loved ones are killed. Of course, I'm gonna hate, and that would make sense. You cannot say, "Oh, well, that's not true love." No, it is true love, and that's actually why the hate is there. So I think, yeah, the work of love is itself a kind of contradiction, because sometimes we don't even have the time for love because we're working so much. And I'm not even talking about work as in like the work of the notion, but like just like uh you know, just a bullshit job or something like this, you know, just like sustenance, like. And then I think it's so pervasive, this feeling like, where the fuck am I going to find love if I'm just at my job and coming home exhausted all the time? So yeah, that's a hard thing. That seems to be an unsublatable contradiction insofar as we live in capitalism, the Marxists would say. But yeah, insofar as it is there, it does seem to be some kind of eternal thing that I'm gonna have to tarry with,
It
as the
seems
world is
like,
such in itself.
sorry, it just seems like in order to, I want to emphasize this point you're making about, of course we we want freedom, love, openness, you know, like, of course. And then the real difficult challenge, and I think the philosophical challenge presents itself, which is that to really know freedom, you have to know slavery. To really know love, you have to know hate. To really know
Mm,
openness, you have to know closure. And so all of these things come with a terrible price. And it seems
yeah,
like people who very spontaneously just think, why can't we all just get along? Why can't we all just love each other? Why can't we all just be more open and free and caring and so forth? It seems like what this form of cognition is struggling to take into itself is this most immense contradiction, is this most immense opposition that if you don't take it in, your form of freedom, your form of love, your form of openness will be very superficial because it will be a form of freedom where you, whether you like it or not, you'll encounter slavery. Whether you like it or not, you'll encounter hate and you'll see it as separate.
yeah.
So, what's the difference between a subject that takes these oppositions into themselves and engages the hard work or we could say the work of the concept?
I think this subject allows themselves to become one with all the negative aspects of the concepts you just talked about. So I am to become one with hatred and one with evil if I want to be good and loving. Now, what does this mean? Does it mean that I have to go out there and be a horrible person? No. This means that I have to explicate this concept and be open to this concept turning into its opposite. So this is where uh, you know, what we've got, like symbolic mediation, comes in. And not only philosophy but literature are, I think, perhaps they are like the highest ways to go about it. Also film and also theater, I think, are included in this. Perhaps also other art forms, but especially for me, literature and philosophy are great here, because and Goethe did this in his early 20s. He broke his heart, and it was, I mean, he felt like killing himself. But then he wrote a book, the Suffering of Young Werther, in which Werther killed himself. For Goethe, this symbolic mediation, because he was Werther, in while writing it, he was Werther. He was this horrible simp that just completely disavowed himself and saw no possibility in live in life except for with this one person that wasn't a possibility. Like, the fact that Goethe allowed himself to do this, and not only write this but publish the book for everyone to read, that's when he went through a process, and that he could, you know, look in retrospect and be like, yeah, this is a tarrying with evil, whereby you come to know um, the good in a truer sense. So um, does that mean I think you can just read and write to know reality? No. I think this is, I want to develop this because I think it's an interesting question, but I think these are this is where the distinction between the soul and the spirit comes in, because I think insofar as it is spirit, symbolic mediation is more effective than when it comes to matters of the soul. So that, what does that mean? I think that when it comes to sex, and we've had the podcast about tantra, sex for Hegel is a matter of the soul. It is located in anthropology, and so the science of the soul for Hegel. And so it is not only conceptual, but it's, to simplify it, closer to nature. And that means that going through the experience itself is probably, you can't just read books about sex to become a great lover, or like a great sexual partner, but like actually going through that process, um, does make this possible. So these are like, I don't want to say caveat, but these are important distinctions. You can't just choose symbolic mediation over reality. You're going to have to go through it, but once you read like Shakespeare, or once you read a great statesman, then you can come to know what they know, in a conceptual manner, and this can help you when you are going to confront the realities of the state. Let's say, like, I'm gonna mention something which is gonna be important, like Henry Kissinger. He's a very intelligent man. When you read Henry Kissinger, you're probably going to learn tons of things about diplomacy and these types of things. And well, it's unpopular because it's a bit evil, the things that he did. It's not the most kind organization in the world, the American state. But yeah, I think these are ways to learn about the actuality of the state and of politics and such.
I was just gonna say, in the same way that you cannot choose symbolic mediation over reality, I don't think you can choose reality over symbolic mediation. I think this is they go hand in hand. I think that you need both. And I think the example you gave of Goethe having his heart broken and thinking about killing himself, and then perhaps finding his truth in the symbolic mediation
Can
of
I
the
just
fiction of his
add
own suicide.
Can I just add one more thing to this? So what he successfully did when he wrote this is that he could release it. He didn't
Mm.
only release it into the world, but he let it off himself. It was not something that occupied him any longer, or at least not to the extent of pain that he experienced, which you can read if you read the book. But when people were reading the book, there were actually people identifying with Werther and started killing themselves. So this is also another aspect of the thing that is quite wild.
Here we could bring in a touch point with the philosophy of right, because in the philosophy of right, Hegel makes this distinction between the arranged marriage and the inclined marriage, and makes this distinction between arranged and inclined on the level of a distinction unique to the modern subject, that modern subjectivity has opened themselves up to, you could say, dating in the modern sense. Whereas we're no longer arranging the relationships between men and women through familial networks, but we are exposing ourselves to the abyssal transcendental function of choosing the other and potentially being burned by the other. And I think that these stories, like whether they're the young Werther or whether they're all of the other forms of modern literature, which are expressing this infinite heartbreak and infinite pain and infinite loss of the other. I think that there's something huge to gain here. I think that there's something huge to gain here. And on the level of maturation, that it seems like subjectivity would remain immature if it didn't confront the abyss of this transcendental function, and as well as endure the loss that comes from loving and losing. And the, it's I want to say it's almost like the naivete and the innocence of someone who falls in love because they don't know the pain that can come with it, versus the capacity to fall in love after being burned.
Hmm.
And I think this is the condition of possibility that arises with the modern subject. And I want to say that this corresponds to a view of subject as I've lost substance, and trying to constantly regain this lost substance, which it sounds like the young Werther is trying to or Goethe's
Yeah.
trying to engage this dimension of loss, versus accepting and even enjoying the lack of the perfect substance. And maybe this is deeply connected to the possibility of the work of love.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely say so. Yeah, it's also there's another contradiction in that term, the work of love, because when I say I'm gonna go to work, it doesn't really sound nice. Like it's if I'm in my grind set, it's like, yeah, I'm gonna get to work, we're gonna get to work. But work uh, does to me to be it seems intrinsically attached to some kind of heaviness, and it's like a seriousness, right? Like work is serious. That's why it's work. It's not some kind of joke. But then love, um yeah, like I think it's a play, right? I think love has that work in it, but it also has kind of like, if I think maybe the truest work of love is to be able to release the work itself, and this is kind of the work of love too. But it's not just fun, like when we're actually gonna talk about the work of love, and like imagine you fall in love and you find someone. Well, it's if this feeling doesn't rise itself to be able to institutionalize itself, or to be able that you're gonna like organize your lives together, then there's no future. Sorry to break it to you, it's very easy to forget this when we fall in love, but sometimes they just live too far, or sometimes they just have their career, which you have your thing, and yeah, you do have that feeling, but it's just not doable. So yeah, what do I want to say with this philosophically is that this like getting to work together is like, I think it's a crucial part of love. So it's not only you are to work on your own love and like go from substance to subject and be able to ride the waves of subjectivity, which are not going to be just like light waves, but also like tsunamis, or maybe just an app and it recedes and there's like just a kind of there's just maybe a desert sometimes. Like all um these difficult things are going to pop up. But yeah, I think this is the to unite work of love, they to unite work and love, they are both sublated into something that's even other to them, I think. And that makes me think about this enlightenment which I just mentioned, and I do think that this is so closely tied with the comical nature of reality. And yeah, Hegel does go into the power of comedy in his philosophy of aesthetics. Like, it's at the very end of the book that he goes into poetry, and he even sees dramatic poetry and its comedic forms as perhaps being the highest forms of art. But I don't want to write off tragedy, because I do think that to go through that tragical process is important. And um
Absolutely. Well,
yeah,
life on, I mean, on the level of the real, I would say that life is tragedy. I think we can't not
yeah,
but go through it on some level. But I wanted to propose that when you were saying that speculatively, thinking that to unite work and love might sublate them into something other than both, I would propose maybe freedom.
yeah, yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. Yeah, 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 that's perfect.
Maybe
Yeah,
that's the point. Like, you need to combine work and love to be free. Like that sounds like a nice. I'm kind of happy with that formula a little bit.
yeah, yeah, I think that's perfect. Yeah, yeah, this is, I mean, Goethe and Schiller were exchanging letters in which they said, our friendship is it's a triad of freedom, work, and love. Oh, no, no, like, no, it was freedom, uh freedom, excellence, and love in work, as this kind of
Okay,
overall.
okay. But yeah, we could connect excellence to our discipline, to our self-limitation, to our work. I think Goethe said that without self-limitation, greatness is impossible or excellence is impossible.
Yeah, yeah, and I think especially self-limitation.
Yeah.
To I'm gonna choose to limit myself to this. Like, you have to have a strength of character to do this, or at least the strength of decision. Like, you have to be saying I'm gonna sacrifice all other things and I'm just gonna choose to limit myself in this way. It's painful too because you lose a lot of potentiality. You beforehand you could choose to go into many things, and you therefore you are all these things, but you have to specialize and self-impose that limit. And I think that's the philosophical process again. That's the philosophical way of life, actually, to limit yourself and then sublate the limitation. Uh, because this is what free thought does. Like thought that isn't free doesn't have its limits are imposed by something else, by an authority, maybe by someone who rates your paper when you write something in academia. That's not self-imposed limitation. Doesn't derive from your own concept.
Shots fired.
Yeah, it's
I think that this idea of self-limitation as being sort of maybe even the ground of the work of love towards freedom is here in need of being situated in something that you do comment on in your True Infinity paper as the mediation of instinct with logic for the
yeah.
cultivation of lifelong learning or lifelong education. And I think that with our university system and our education system today, it's almost like we struggle to bring together instinct and logic into a mediation that is, let's say, a true or a genuine education. What do you think's the stakes of that? What do you think the stakes are of, I mean, and this coming from someone whose first paper is titled Hegelian Tantra, which is kind of exactly pointing in this direction.
Yeah. Yeah, Zizek recently released a good article in which he made a point that he made thousands of times, is that the difference between authenticity and inauthenticity isn't so difficult to make. Uh, what he says is authenticity is when you do not rely on a split that inauthenticity does rely on. So what does that mean concretely? Well, this means that on the one hand, I have my logic or my, let's say, my conscious project, and on the other hand, I have my pathologies, which I try to repress with showing how clean and non-contradictory my conscious project is, my like egoic project. Um, that's not authentic. That's being incredibly self-opposed to yourself. And that the problem with academia, or like this type of institutionalization, like especially when I have to write something that will be deemed good or bad by a limitation that's not imposed by myself, is that I have to be I have to I have to show that I'm non-contradictory to the other, which I also think is non-contradictory. Otherwise I wouldn't even care about going into that process, right? And I can sustain this dynamic of, okay, I'm gonna create something non-contradictory for them, seemingly non-contradictory for it, and they're gonna say it is non-contradictory, and then on the side, I just can disavow the fact that I'm a split subject with pathologies, and which is irreconciled with itself. So this is not authentic. This is a good example of what is not authentic. An example of what is authentic is when you take that when you take that, well, perhaps it's when you become disillusioned by the limitation imposed by another, and you fall to your own abyss and necessitate yourself to uphold your own self-limitation, and or like to keep to your own self-limitation. So you move from authority to conscience, instead of basing what I think and what I deem right by the authority which imposes its limitation, and measuring myself in regards to the limitation. I just come up with my own self-limitation, my conscience, and then start measuring myself up to my own conscience, which is of course myself, no matter how universal I take that conscience to be. And so yeah, I think to work with this, you can see this in Kant, right? Massively. Like for Kant, he was massively struggling with pathology, and like pathology is a big word in Kant's own project because it's like a category, like an imperative, the categorical imperative, or like moral uh, being a moral person for Kant is kind of like this eternal striving, because you always want to get rid of your own little thing, so that you can actually embody the universality that you want to embody. So let's say I want to be good for others. For Kant, if I am good for others in a universal manner, but I also enjoy that, I'm getting too much out of this, and that's pathological for Kant. So what I just want to say, Kant was moving beyond authority to conscience, and this is also what made him a great philosopher with the influence he had. Now Hegel makes another step, which I try to work with in the work of love paper, that this type of conscience is not the end all be all, and there is and in the philosophy of right, Hegel describes this by the term ethical life, that you have to not only measure yourself up to yourself, but also measure yourself up to the other. And then I would say that the name of this measure to yourself and the other, that's the concept again. It's the concept as the unity of the I and the other. So usually the common way to understand the word concept is like, I'm gonna have a concept and then measure it up to reality, and once it agrees, then it's it becomes a fixated static agreement, so it's true, it's eternal, or it's an abstract self-identity. For Hegel, it's actually, well, you have to measure up a concept to its concept, and this, if you actually make it into a abstract self-identity, then actually then you're not working with going into the process of measuring, like working up a concept through its own concept. And I think this has everything to do with like that self-limitation that you impose on yourself, but also choosing the limitation that you're going to tarry with in the other, right? Because they are working with their own self-limitation, or their limitation, but let's say they're working with their own self-limitation. Me entering into a relationship with such a person, such a true infinity, I'm I guess enriching also my own process of this work of love. Yeah.
I think that nicely segues into conversations at the intersection of Hegel and Kant on religion and morality, which is really central to your work of love paper. And specifically here, we get the distinction, and I want to sort of test how broadly relevant or true this distinction is between Kant's view of religion and Christianity as a religion of morality versus Hegel's view of religion and Christianity as a religion of love, and what's at stake in this distinction between morality and love as it relates to the work of love.
The next Philosophy Portal course focuses on the concept and tradition of Christian atheism. Throughout the course, we will try to investigate the philosophical foundations of this notion, as well as articulate how this notion practically informs the modern history of philosophy. This will include analysis of transcendentalism in German idealism, political economy in Marxism, existentialism in Nietzsche, psychoanalysis in the Freudo-Lacanian tradition, the theology of Thomas Altizer, as well as investigations of living thinkers like Slavoj Žižek and Peter Rollins. The course will also include live guest contributions from Slavoj Žižek, Peter Rollins, Barry Taylor, and others. To get involved or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online.
Yeah, so it relates to the distinction that I've also been working between instinct and logic. And in his 20s, Hegel was struggling with religion all the time. When he was very young, he was actually opposed to Christianity, or saw Christianity as being like perverted and becoming empty rituals. And he saw like this he saw possibility in an invigoration that is inspired by the Greeks to create a mythology of reason, to then progulgate this to the world or proselytize it to the world. But he retracted from this in his later life. Anyhow, so Hegel later on comes to see Christianity as the religion of love. But, well, what kind of love? Well, the love of feeling, love that is not propositional. Then, and I think this is perhaps the biggest turn he makes in his life, is that he comes to see God as the concept. God as the word, God as the concept. So then he thinks, well, yeah, love, for it to be true, has to be raised to thinking. And this is the movement of the concept. So in other words, a love that is mere feeling and a religion of love that is based on a mere feeling is not how, yeah, wouldn't be desirable for Hegel, but also it wouldn't get to the truth of religion, because the truth of religion is not within religion itself and the imagery itself, but what type of thinking it drives us towards, which maybe sounds very contradictory, but what I'm trying to say is that philosophy is the truth of religion, and Christianity presenting us with a trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. If we just, represent these with religious art or with religious kind of mysticism, or just like a communal feeling inside of a church or inside of a sect, this doesn't really get at the truth of religion, because what these representations like the Trinity are getting at is, for Hegel, the absolute idea, the speculative concept, which raises all these things that religion is working with to thought, to thinking. So this is why Hegel was once, I believe he was critiqued for it. He didn't go to church so often. So people said to him, well, why don't you go to church? And Hegel said, well, thinking is also service to God. And so this is Hegel's idea of religion, I think. To think and is a divine type of service. And I think this is perhaps where you can also see the difference between meditation, which I would link more closely to spirituality, prayer, which I would link to religion, and then thinking, which I would relate to philosophy. Each of them have their place, and each of them are valid, and each of them are limited, but also, unlimited in a way. But yeah, like I think this is I think the way Hegel comes to see the truth of Christianity, but then also goes beyond it. To be honest, he goes beyond the truth of Christianity, which is like this. Me saying this is also very controversial. This was hugely discussed when Hegel died by Feuerbach or other philosophers. Like, is he maybe just a philosopher that is a theologian? Maybe he's just doing it all in disguise to proselytize Christianity or something like this. But yeah, that's an interesting discussion.
Absolutely. I still, I getting the idea here that Hegel in his own work, Hegel in his own process is moving from a notion of love, which is, like you said, attached to feeling, to a notion of love that is attached to thinking. And here, I guess one of the big struggles is to move from a notion of love that's tied to feeling towards a notion of love tied to thinking. You have to overcome a lot of repression. You have to overcome you have to think things that probably most people would be uncomfortable to think. You have to think the unity of things that people would oftentimes be uncomfortable to think. And this brings me to the notion, which I think you know all too well, which is the notion of shame, and the notion of shame of oneself, the notion of shame of one's body, and the way in which shame can get in the way of, let's say, thinking love in a concrete sense, embodying love, if you like, in a concrete sense. In the paper, The Work of Love, you say that the heart that blames itself if there are obstacles to the actualization of its love is ashamed of love. And love has to be in something that's in a union with itself, but also a union that doesn't annihilate separation, which is another one of these strange Hegelian forms of logic where you're thinking things in a weird unity that are usually thought apart, in this sense, union and separation, or what you talk about as a unity with difference. How can we as philosophers learn to love in this way and learn to think in this way, to think with radical difference, to think with a unity that is including within itself separation?
Well, I'm trying my best to do this in my own life. To do this. Yeah, I think it's It's truly an infinite process, but that doesn't mean it's endless in a bad finite way. And so I think this is,
I'm thinking here about the violent encounter with difference, the violent encounter with separation that we can experience. And at the same time, how can we see beauty in that? Thinking about the relationship between beauty and violence, and oftentimes these are thought separately, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's a huge one. Yeah. Yeah, no, beauty is violent. And yeah, I mean, I of course I don't have a final answer that's going to be satisfactory to anyone. Not myself too, but I think that, yeah, to me it comes back to this type of resoluteness that also lets go of itself to resolve. Now you can never say when you have to do this. Like, let's say you are in a very difficult situation with your partner where they did something very bad, or you did something very bad. Like, you can be resolute and like say, well, no, I didn't make this mistake. Or you can even say that, you can blame the other for their making the mistake. But to be forgiving and to know when to be forgiving, this is the nature of, to know when to make a decision. And when do you know when to make a decision? This is what Hegel's philosophy helps us to work ourselves up to. It's not, Hegel's philosophy doesn't decide for us. It cannot make a decision for you, but it can help you to make a decision. And how does it help you to make a decision? Well, because it has a certain method of thinking, and I would say, like, again, like, it's kind of a branching of the concept into all its differentiations. Like, just open up the science of logic, right? You have like being, essence, concept, but then being has all these different categories. And I think going through the process of encountering negativity in the concept in each sphere and at each stage and in each dimension and in all registers, I think this is kind of a radicality that one is to go into if one wants to learn to know when to make a decision. Because we make a decision when we conclude. That's how the science of logic is structured. Like, at the very end of the science of logic, there's the what's called the Endschluss. So it's a contradictory word in German, because Schluss means to close, and there's beschließen, which is to decide, but it's also to enclose. But Entschließen is also to unclose. So it's a closure that's an opening. So you can see it's the speculative German word again, just like Aufhebung, that the absolute idea decides to become nature. And so yeah, and then this is like the beginning of a new process of working with resoluteness and resolution. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't answer your question. It's an impossible question. I can't believe you asked me this.
Well, the unity, I mean, I would just say, like, I would bring it back again to the image on this cover, where there you have perhaps a unity with difference here. And then here you have like kind of a unity with itself, a unity with sameness. And I think that at least what I take from your work of love paper is that a love which is a work with sameness, a reduction to sameness, is more of a narcissistic moment. And it's this encounter, this traumatic encounter with a difference. And usually when we encounter difference, and it's always a possibility, I think, in love, when we encounter difference, that we find irreconcilable differences. And we could go on to talk about divorce rates, and everything in divorce is what? It's always irreconcilable differences is the reason for the separation. And I think that means that we live in a culture which actually doesn't know how to love in this way. We have a culture that doesn't actually know what the work of love is. And so I just wanted to, I guess, ask that question or frame that question, because I think your paper on the work of love is setting the groundwork for a logic for the global brain, where we could rebuild again a culture that knows how to work with traumatic difference, and it doesn't a priori lead to a decision, to your point, a closure, which ends in a escape, a going separate ways, but a maintenance of the contradiction there. I think if we lose that, we lose the culture potentially.
Yeah, I'm definitely split here, and this is also why I wrote 2 papers, which something that I try to do implicitly. I don't mention it explicitly, but it was for the readers to figure out. Is that I also wrote 2 papers to show, and the conclusion of both papers is actually the opposite, because in the True Infinity paper, I conclude that true infinity is the truth, but in the love paper, I actually conclude that finitude is like the truth. Like love is, and this I take from Wagner, that it's some I forgot which piece it was, but someone decides to sacrifice the transcendent beyond to be with his loved one. But then the dialectical twist here, which Wagner and Zizek don't go into, is that actually in this finitude you find the true, this is the true eternity. So you don't find that like you have to,
which is kind of a joke.
It's a joke. Yeah,
there's something funny about
ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. You have to lose, mourn, and decide to distance yourself from eternity, to choose finitude, so that you can actually choose the eternity in that finitude, which the former eternity wasn't even close to getting at. And I think this is this is love as a work of purification, and like kind of a magical, this is kind of like Hegel calls it magical, because it's non-being that turns into being. It comes from nothing, and love is like, love is that self-creation of nothing, of like something out of nothing. And this is beautiful. I think this is, to me, really what is so beautiful about Hegel's philosophy, is that it does show you in the vastness of its differentiation in the logical categories in different ways, like that something can come from nothing. So whenever you're left with nothing and you thought you had something, well, there's something can come from nothing. But it's up to you. You yourself have to decide to create yourself out of that nothing. This creation ex nihilo. This is to me, this is also closely tied with art and such, because I think we could differentiate the work of love between the sphere of the family in ethical life, which is closely tied to feeling, and then also this is where art as sensuous comes in, watching a great movie together, like these types of things, right? Or making some artwork together. But also love that objectifies itself as the state is not really, it has nothing to do with that feeling type love. It is love and it is spirit. There's God's march in history, as Hegel says, but this love is the concept as existent in world history. So you do also get a lot of violence violence there. Yeah.
What do you think is the role of Christianity in all of this? We've touched on it a little bit already. You noted how Hegel is sometimes seen as a philosopher who's thinking beyond Christianity, but there's lots of debates about this. I mean, Kant has his own view of Christianity, which is much more tied to the moral law. Hegel has a view of Christianity, which is much more tied to the act of love. How do you think philosophers inspired by the modern tradition should be thinking about Christianity today, and what relevance do you think this has for your ideas around the work of love?
Yeah, I think for me, religion is really a black hole. to think. I don't want to say too much on it because I don't feel like I can really. Yeah, I also don't really have a stake in it, but I'm also not really. Yeah, I'm not so. I mean, I have thought about it, but I'm a bit at a loss with how to think it because I'm not interested in building religion or like building religious organizations. I am interested in, you know, like observing or analyzing or going into those things. I have looked into it, or also spirituality. I find interesting. I'm big on mysticism, Christian mysticism, like Meister Eckhart, for example. I think it's huge, but mysticism and religion proper is always has had a very uneasy relationship. Meister Eckhart, I don't know if he was excommunicated from the church. I I think after he died. But he was a huge figure, and so like the true mystics always are scapegoated by institutionalized religion, and mysticism itself it is religious, but it is art. This is at least the way Hegel thinks about mysticism. This is why it's located in the philosophy of aesthetics and not, the philosophy of religion. It doesn't get its proper treatment there. So yeah, I'm big on mysticism as this kind of religious poetry. And I think there's an importance to this actually, because Hegel himself says that speculative philosophy is nothing but mysticism that's also scientific. So he sees the truth of mysticism and the poetic expression of the absolute there, and he wants then to raise it to the method, as he says himself. It's the absolute method, the movement of the concept. So yeah, what does that have to do with religion proper? I'm not so sure. But I do see myself like as my YouTube channel and Substack. I have this little motto called like express art, explore religion, and then explicate philosophy. So this is how I'm. This is yeah how I'm living. But yeah, I don't want to identify with anything. I like Christian atheism. I like this idea that it all amounted to nothing. God on earth.
Yeah, it's super interesting to think about the historical dialectic between institutions and mysticism, and the way in which, when you think about both of these things as a unity, there's something of like a relationship between the law and its transgression. I'm thinking here about like inherent transgression, that
Yeah.
almost like you need kind of both. Like without the institution, you wouldn't have the law to transgress, but without the mystic, you would just have a rigidified moral law. So that you kind of have to think about both in like again, like this weird unity. And this is kind of also to demonstrate like once you start thinking with this form of logic, you start finding these weird unities all over the place, and you open up new ways of thinking about things that otherwise would get caught into these seemingly opposed binaries, right? Like between institutions and mysticism or something like that.
Yeah. This is super good, and I think perhaps like religion is necessarily inauthentic for this reason, because the moment you institutionalize, as you said, it has to. What did you say? Like this inherent transgression, right? So like religion doesn't say come up with your own self limit and become yourself as a free subject. No, it says here's the limit. Go to church every Sunday, and oftentimes it always comes with a transaction. Weirdly enough, even though Christianity, you would think, has nothing to do with this, or like the Abrahamic tradition doesn't have nothing to do with this, and Christian atheism doesn't have anything to do with this. But the moment always it's going to be institutionalized, and you have to move away from. Yeah, it doesn't just become subjects making themselves out of their own self limitation, but also like the imposition of a limitation, which is necessary for society and the state. There's going to be problems of inauthenticity there. There's going to be problems of, just go to church. It's super inauthentic. It's like, this is all fake, guys. And yeah, people in the 19th century and early 20th century, they were writing fantastic novels or like philosophy showing how fake it all is. So yeah, I do, on a fundamental basis here, I do agree with, I do see a lot in what Hegel says, that the Greek realm is the realm of art, then the Roman realm is the realm of religion, and the German realm in world history is now the realm of philosophy. So if we think about art as something that reconciles us, this is what it did in the Greek realm, in Greek civilization. This is also where, you know, Plato is kind of an artist. He's not writing a treatise, he's writing dialogues, just like Aristotle also wrote dialogues, which are, I guess, all lost. But there was an insurmountable opposition here, which is expressed the best in Antigone, as you know, Hegel believes. And then we get the Roman world, and then we get Christianity emerging in the Roman world, which actually mediates the Roman world to a novel form of spirit, which is the German world. Now, Christianity goes through its Reformation, and it goes to, you know, humanism, enlightenment, and Hegel does believe that now the civilizational world spiritual task for the task of civilizational reconciliation with itself is up to philosophy to bring about. This is already what the French Revolution and the Communist revolutions were attempting to get at, right? You don't get the religious figure or a warlord or like some excellent Greek figure leading the way, some general like you know, whoever, some aristocracy or whatever. No, you get these collectives which seem to have immanentized the absolute, to have gotten rid of that transcendence. You know, materialism is the word here. It's not about God up there, but it's about, you know, we want freedom in this world right now, and we're gonna bring it about. But then something that emerges is that it's this one-sided immanentization becomes its own transcendence. Like, take the notion of the people in historical materialism. Like, they kind of have the position of God. You know, or like I'm talking about the 20th century communist movements, like this faith, this groundless faith in the proletariat, which will unite and then bring forth emancipation. And I think we have to be careful with this, but I think there's also, I think this is also the truth of religion in a sense. Like, I think Ernst Bloch already said this. He was a communist East German theologian and philosopher. And so, yeah, I think, like, can we see the truth of immanence and transcendence in a yeah, like, for today, not only philosophically, but also can we like extrapolate this to politics? I think this is the ultimate task actually for today. This is the ultimate task. And religion is definitely part of this, to think religion seriously and deeply. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's a mega question, right? And that's part of the reason why I think I'm starting to develop the course on Christian atheism, is because this does need to be thought seriously. And so, you know, I'm definitely oriented and thinking in that direction. But I want to bring back in the kind of creative triad we generated together earlier in the conversation. That is the unity between work and love towards freedom. It seems like that would be an interesting formula to think what you were talking about as the 20th century communist God, as a groundless faith in the proletariat. And perhaps this project didn't have a good enough grounding in the unity of work and love. I would propose the work of love as something which needs a deeper engagement in perhaps Marxist dialectical circles.
Yeah.
It's an open question, but like, what is the relationship between, you know, what is the relationship between classical Marxism and traditional Christianity, and how does the work of love figure into this process? And if we miss one of the equations, if we just focus on work without love, if we just focus on love without work, we miss this unity.
Yeah, totally. I do think Zizek, as a communist, does really believe in this fundamental idea of like sublating work and love to freedom, and the name of this is what he calls communism. But I do think, yeah, that we have to take the intimate sphere as extremely seriously, and this is actually where everything starts. It starts with, this is why I worked on this Dialectic of the I trilogy for 2.5 years, based on phenomenology of spirit and science of logic, and then the philosophy of right. Then it's now finished. And so this is how I'm trying to make philosophy personal, you know. I'm thinking through this massively personal thing, but I'm not just preoccupied with the I, because the I is an other, and that's a funny little joke. And then I go about it in my own way in my articles. But yeah, to stay with the I, and to think of the I in this abstract manner that is of to think through the logical forms of the I, the way it negates and sublates itself, and everything that I kind of write about, or like that, and that's inspired by Hegel. Like, I think first we have to take this to the intimate sphere, and only then can we actually, you know, like, yeah, we have to move within the intimate sphere to create a freedom there, and only then can we move on to higher forms of objective freedom, like the freedom to the property rights, something like this, you know. But there's a contradiction here, of course, because, you know, to how can I even do this if I don't even have property? You see what I mean? Like, you need to build a family, you need a house. But also, by building a family, you're gonna learn a lot about the intimate sphere, and this is what all of this is getting at, is the truth of ethical life, that aren't truths that we are going to impose philosophically with our abstractions, but this is truth that, you know, lots of so-called common people know way deeper than some philosophers, or like embody them in a deeper way. And I think that it would be interesting to think about actualizing freedom, or like objectifying emancipation, love, with this word ethical life. You know, like, this is where it works. So how do we build this out? How do we enculture and develop ourselves in this? And then you get the questions of state politics, but perhaps we shouldn't immediately go into party politics, and like, what political party are you gonna create or vote for? But the question of objective legality and the constitution, and also the question of institution as a term, an institution as a rationality that is for itself, right? An institution is self-replicating. This is also where you get the problem of bureaucracy, as bureaucracy is that institutionalized self-replication of just, I guess, the complete loss of any sense of asserting self-limitation and just upholding a limitation which is imposed by another. And there's no sense of I'm responsible for limitation in bureaucracy. Like, it's a hell always to talk with the bureaucracy, and you talk to someone and they say, well, I cannot help you, maybe this department. And you go to that department and they say, well, no, that department actually can help you. And you go to them and say, oh yeah, maybe yes, but not now. But it's always such a crazy thing to me that bureaucracy exists. It's this pure submersion into the other, right? It's kind of it's obscene, it's monstrosity. But yeah, like, I think this is also an
I
important
quite
question.
agree.
Like state politics, like, today there's a discussion of, okay, do we still live in capitalism or not? I have no idea. But what is true about this discussion is that it doesn't seem to be a choice between state organized economy or a so-called free economy in this globalized world. That's even before that globalized world, it wasn't even that kind of question. And Peter Thiel writes about it in his own way. Like, capitalism means that you want to monopolize the market. That's the goal. And as soon as you monopolize the market, and as soon as you become a huge institution on an international basis, you're gonna become Soviet-esque, as David Graeber showed so well in his work. You know, that David Graeber showed that it seems like it's very efficient, everything, but the bigger these organizations get, the more of this perverted, like, underbelly there's going to be, like this bureaucratic kind of self-replicating thing that just is it's just like self-interested particularity that has objectified itself without any sense of singular universality. Like there's no face of the bureaucracy, right? It's faceless. So this is, yeah, this is why I find the notion of a centralized world government, I find it ridiculous. I think it's going to be so rife with corruption that I don't want to go there. And I know that's a communist ideal. I know that's the communist world state, whether it's a government or not, I don't even care. But that's not desirable. We have to work with ethical life right now to see how we can objectify it. And perhaps the nation state is an important moment of that. And we do need to be patriotic here. Yeah.
I mean, lots to go on there, and definitely here grounding it with the ethical system and the emphasis on family and the intimate sphere, and emphasizing, for example, that there are many non-philosophers that actually embody the dimension of love and the dimension of care for the other in a way that philosophers only have perhaps a conceptual grasp of. Philosophers cannot impose themselves in this way. And at the same time, I think that a proper dedication to philosophical life could, in principle, enhance the ethical system if enacted, and just simply enacted in the right way, probably from the bottom up instead of a top-down imposition. And I think that starts with something that we've already discussed, but I think it's worth bringing it up, perhaps towards a closing note, which is that this is the way you end the work of love, that the only eternity worth seeking is a love that is precisely with the finite other. And here juxtaposing that with the type of love which is reified in a transcendental God and a transcendental heaven. And I think that the interesting thing to think there is that when we think about stereotypical conservative familial life, usually this familial life is upheld by such a transcendent God figure. It's upheld by such a God of the beyond figure. And perhaps this is why these types of cultural organizations can constantly fall into a type of ironic hypocrisy, because they are in some ways contradicting themselves unreflectively, and in that sense would benefit from philosophy. So I do think, again, to emphasize, I think the stakes of your work, and again, to reference the context of your work in the anthology as a whole, I think the stakes of our work is to think through a logic that really could have a new grounding for a new culture and a new approach to politics, in a very, in a very potentially radical way. But I just want to get your impression on sort of this distinction again that I'm bringing up between, and I think this brings us full circle with the true infinity and the work of love. What's at stake with the eternity here being found in the finite other versus the eternity being found in the otherly worldly projection?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to deal with unbearable disillusions constantly. And that it is up to us to face this, to be aware of it, and then to think it through. And to do this in your concrete life, in your ethical life, that is philosophy as a way of life. Now, I would say that this ultimately is to be a political project with political ramifications and political consequence. And I do, what we said on, like, yeah, sublating work and love for freedom. I don't think, it seems to me like preceding movements have taken up this idea. There is singular figures in also the 20th century communist movement which had this, they had a lifelong partner and then struggled together. And there's beautiful cases you can read about here. But is, like, can we take this idea and then politicize it in a way that is actually, that is for world spirit, that is for world spirit, which has its absolute right? This is, for Hegel, it's world spirit that has the highest right. And I think in my own life, this is also, I always think about absolute spirit here, which is for the sublation of subjective and objective spirit, which is where you enter into the realm of true infinity on the dimension of sense with art and all the different kinds of art forms you have here, and also religion in representation and I guess iconography, and also the conceptual thought. So to take that all with you and have it immanent as an absolute transcendence that is kind of in a free unity. I think this is this is to be made into a political project. And as you say, there's many people who are not philosophical who are way better at like certain aspects of ethical life that philosophers are not. So we cannot create an abstract unity. We cannot create a philosophical unity for a political movement that is based on abstract self-identity of like, oh, we all agree with Hegel or something. No, we have to we can create a philosophical unity for a political project, but it has to be based in the truth of ethical life.
And so that means it starts with the family, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in this sort of, for people who aren't aware, basically Hegel's ethical system with the philosophy of right involves a dialectic between the family and the community and the state. Do you see these dialectical links, the dimensions between these three things? And perhaps this is also pointing towards our philosophy of right conference in October, but do you see these three things in a dialectical relation that can be instantiated today, or do you have some skepticism whether these connections are still linkable? When we think about the rise of digital interfaces, when we think about the rise of global capital, do these things destabilize family, community, and state too fundamentally to be reestablished, or is there some semblance of hope?
uh,
I suppose we'll figure out in the work
yeah,
of
no,
love.
I think Zizek said this perfectly well. It's not, there is no hope. There is no hope. There's no hope for the future, but there is hope in the past. There is hope in the past, and there's so many failed projects in the past that we can learn so much from. And by researching this, we can change the future. And in that sense, there is hope. It's not closed. It is closed, but it's not closed.
Okay. Well, on that ambiguous and contradictory closing statement, we'll again sort of point towards that what we've discussed today are two articles from the third philosophy portal anthology, Logic for the Global Brain, both a paper on true infinity, as well as a paper titled The Work of Love by Dimitri Crooijmans. I'll leave links in the description to the anthology where you can either read a free preview of the anthology or pick up a physical or a digital version of the anthology for yourself. If you're a student or a member of Philosophy Portal, you have free access to all of our publications in PDF form. And so if you're in that category, you'll already know about that. I guess I'll give you the final word, Dimitri. What should people be looking out for in your papers? And if they're interested in investigating your work more, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can, I have a Substack, as you said, linked in the description. I have a YouTube channel. I'm very sporadically active, and but yeah, if you happen to read my work, you can always message me. Something about my work is that my work is, it is a totality. I do see it as a system as a whole. So I have moved from the Hegelian Tantra paper in the Phenomenology of Spirit anthology to in the Abyssal Arrows anthology, written about shame and innocence and creativity, and now which then brought me further to thinking through infinity and love. And also I have this work on the dialectic of the eye and some other articles. So yeah, there is a continuity there, but also each work I try to make each work stand on its own. So that's it. And you can always reach out if you read my work and you violently disagree and you want to let me know how, in what manner that that was.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for the conversation, Dimitri. Again, True Infinity and the Work of Love with Dimitri Crooijmans from Logic for the Global Brain. And for everyone who's been listening us for this last 2 hours, have a great evening.
The third Philosophy Portal anthology, Logic for the Global Brain, is now available. To pick up a copy, visit philosophyportal.online. The next Philosophy Portal course focuses on the concept and tradition of Christian atheism. Throughout the course, we will try to investigate the philosophical foundations of this notion, as well as articulate how this notion practically informs the modern history of philosophy. This will include analysis of transcendentalism in German idealism, political economy in Marxism, existentialism in Nietzsche, psychoanalysis in the Freudo-Lacanian tradition, the theology of Thomas Altizer, as well as investigations of living thinkers like Slavoj Žižek and Peter Rollins. The course will also include live guest contributions from Slavoj Žižek, Peter Rollins, Barry Taylor, and others. To get involved or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online. Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept.